I want to thank everyone for joining today's sports gambling education webinar. We're extremely excited to have members of the Sponsor United team as our guests today. My name is Scott Shelton from Siena Education Services. And I'm really proud to help produce today's webinar with our esteemed panel. Today we have two panelists from Sponsor United. We've got Bob Lynch, the founder and president, and we've also got Chad Groves in partnership. And of course, leading today's discussion is our very own Director of Sports Gambling Education at Ohio University, Jim Kahler. Just a few housekeeping items for everyone on today's webinar. If you missed any of the past webinars from this year, including our last webinar earlier this month on tribal gaming, you can go replay them right now at our website, sportsgamblingeducation.com. And while you're there, you can use this promo code just for attending today's webinar. That's OUB101 for the Ohio University Bobcats. And that's good for 25% off any individual course or the master certification course bundle. So next month, we are launching our very first course in a series of courses that focus on daily fantasy sports. This is led by an impressive group of experts in the industry, including Peter Schenke, who is the president and founder of RotoWire, and he's also a board member for the Fantasy Sports and Gaming Association. You can stay up to date on that course launch, as well as future webinar dates and topics by following our sports gambling education program on LinkedIn. If we have time towards the end of today's session, we will get to a few questions from our attendees, so be sure to post those questions in our Q&A box or chat window below. So now, Jim, I will turn it over to you and our esteemed panel.
Thanks, Scott. And Bob and Chad, I can't thank you enough for joining us today as we get another webinar underway. But I was really excited to have both of you because of the work that we've been fortunate to do with Sponsor United at Ohio University. And we like to give our students as much of an edge before they break into the business of sport as possible. And our relationship with you has certainly done just that. So welcome aboard.
Thanks for having us, Jim. Appreciate the time.
Great to be on.
And the partnership.
Yes. So Bob, I'm going to start with you. Sponsor United has really been rapidly adopted by 95% of the professional sports teams and agencies out there. Before we get going, can you give our listeners just a little bit more background on the company, why you created it, and maybe what's around the corner?
I was thinking about the event today, and similar to the gaming industry, data is so critical when you're making bets, and to the end user. And you would probably not want to walk into an environment being a heavy sort of better in the sporting space without being equipped with as much information as possible to make these decisions. And just like in that industry where, institutional knowledge certainly gets you a long way, what really separates high performance is just being able to infuse the right sort of data sets into that. And when we looked at the sponsorship industry, an industry that continues to evolve, so many more variables that are involved in these partnership deals that has ever taken place, the need for better, smarter, faster data to make decisions and be more efficient was a critical thing that we were looking at as well. And so the foundation of Sponsor United is we have an industry, sports and entertainment, that's just exploded in terms of the assets that could be leveraged, the creativity that goes into these partnerships, the categories that are emerging that none of us even knew about 5 or 10 years ago, including the one that we're talking about today. And so knowing that there's such sort of innovation taking place, there was really no standardized place where all of that information was stored and could be applied to all the different needs and challenges that are taking place in our industry. And so as an organization, we attempt to essentially collect, map, track all of that data in one place, in some ways no different than, let's say, Google does, and then distribute that information to the industry, to really all participants of the industry, either on the buy side, sell side, or on the collaborative side, to hopefully sort of make the industry that much smarter and more informed.
Great. And Chad, you have you're one of really the first employees with Sponsor United. You started there as an intern going back to March of 2017, coming out of Robert Morris University. Can you explain to our audience your role within the company as it relates to partnerships and sponsorships?
Yeah, so coming out of school, I'll never forget when I was on the phone with Bob here, and it was my time to pick a full-time offer to accept. And something that stood firm with me was, he said, whenever you pick a job out of school, it should never be based on your title, salary, or location, but based on the people there and the opportunity to develop and how much of an impact you're going to make early on in your career. So that's really what led me to come on to Sponsor United over any other offer I had, and was able to become the first full-time partnerships hire under Rajiv Khanna on our team, who's our SVP. So simply put, my day-to-day role is revenue generation and bringing on as many organizations as possible onto our platform that are in sales roles. I primarily work on the property side. So anyone that's like a team, agency looking to do a deal with a brand partner in any way. Love what we've been able to accomplish, over 500 partnerships ever since we started the company. And about over 50% of those, I would say, are on the property side. So very successful. It's built for someone in that role, such as Bob was at the Dolphins. And it's really the relationships that we've been able to make and the impact we've been able to make on the industry that I thrive and just keep on going every day and loving what we do here.
Well, you all do some amazing work, and I'd like to start the Q&A with a report that I pulled out going back to July of 2020. And in that report, DraftKings was noted as the most active brand in this category. And from what I could see, way ahead of William Hill and FanDuel, who were ranked second and third respectively. So can you give us an update on what you're seeing within the category, and maybe a little bit of insights on the major players, and then maybe a little bit of insight on some players that our listeners might not be that familiar with?
Well, DraftKings continues to lead the way in terms of their partnerships and diversity of partnerships they have, both within sort of the sponsorship space as well as within media. What we've seen over the last 12 months or so is, FanDuel's certainly been more aggressive, and everybody's aware of what they do. BetMGM, PointsBet have really actually come into the fray much more as well. Some of these opportunities have opened up. Prior to being acquired by Bally's on the non-sort of transactional side of things, Monkey Knife Fight started to make a pretty big sort of dip into the sponsorship space, doing some creative things, and probably helped them in terms of being acquired. They were able to kind of quickly gain a nice following. And William Hill sort of hasn't kept pace in that regard, I would say. When we look globally, they're about fifth most active in total partnerships that they have, more so on the international side. And Betway, if we sort of factored in internationally, they're a top three brand as well.
Okay, and as more and more states are coming on board, you see some patterns developing there. But in particular, I was keeping a close eye on Colorado, which opened up I don't know, all of a sudden I started to see PointsBet popping in. So how does geography play into the overall category when you look at it?
It really is like a land grab in a lot of ways, from everything that we've heard and the people that we've talked to, in terms of being there first is so critical in terms of winning customers. And if you're not, it becomes a challenging situation to sort of come in later into that environment and begin to shift people over to whatever platforms you serve. And so making, for lack of a better term, early bets in some of these markets and investing and sort of building infrastructure against that has been really critical to win in that space, and really figuring out what are the states that you should begin to bet early on to be there. But that's probably one of the most critical things that we're seeing. And some of these markets are really interesting. They're not necessarily your larger markets. You saw what happened in Iowa recently, and the unique factor to this is, in some cases, like taking Iowa is probably a good example. There may not be large well-known sports properties in the traditional sense of things, but it might be in everything from sort of massive state fairs to minor league teams to the college space. And so navigating sort of the unknown in some of these markets that are still rich in opportunity is something that I think on the buy side for brands in this space, they're really having to become familiar, really deeply familiar with certain markets and where the opportunities lie to grab the largest share of sort of attention.
And to your point, Jim, about Colorado specifically being such a booming place for this category, our team put out some content where it actually identified top markets for total deals in this category, and Denver was number 3 after New York and Philadelphia. So there are some non-traditional markets that you think wouldn't be immediately jumping the gun, but just kind of case by case.
And Bob, when you say land grab, and I think of, as Chad just mentioned, Denver, I think of loyal fan bases. And I got to believe that the Denver Broncos have one of the more loyal fan bases that don't only cover the Denver area, but the entire state. How does brand loyalty to the property relate when you're seeing the category continue to grow from a sponsorship standpoint?
Denver was always, when I was in the NFL, Denver was one of the more impressive organizations just in terms of their sheer market coverage and geographic coverage. If you look at sort of the Midwest and where their fan base comes from, I think it's like 17 different cities, major cities that, that call the Broncos their most favorite team. So, to that point, they certainly have that affinity for the team, which benefits them when they're going to partners. I think for the Broncos in their particular instance, being able to look at this large fan base and begin to figure out where and how do our different partners integrate. And as many people on this call may already know, they have several partnerships in this space, and being able to sort of carve out these areas where they either don't cross over to each other, but they provide value in that space. Has been critical for them to be able to sort of balance all these different partnerships. I don't think it's that different than other categories, honestly, where, these are broad fan bases, especially in the NFL. You're talking to the majority of the community as a whole. And so within that, they're going to have different subsets of fans, older, younger, tech heavy, different generations, the one that grew up with, Peyton Manning playing versus John Elway, let's say. And so I think it's also how they speak to them from a content perspective as well.
Okay. That's a great segue, but what are you seeing as far as exclusivity in the average number of sponsors in this category as more and more states are coming on board with legalized sports wagering?
Almost 2/3 of the deals that we've seen in major pro sports are exclusive, about 63% currently. It's probably slightly less than that. One of the factors is opportunity to have a second partner in there. In some cases, teams are starting to carve out some rights, so they might be exclusive to sponsorship, but not to some of their ancillary media, which for the betting space, content, digital content, co-branded content is so critical for them as well, to be able to sort of get that messaging out there. But on average, the typical team has almost 2 different brands that are aligned with those teams. We're seeing the ranges of exclusivity are changing, though. If you look across, let's say NFL versus MLB or Major League Soccer and whatnot. In MLS, it's about 50% of deals of the teams that do have deals have only one deal. But if you look at Major League Baseball, it's 4 out of 5 of the teams have an exclusive deal or one partner in that space. So there is a range based on the sort of league and environment that you're in as well.
Okay. And you, Bob, you touched on it, but sponsored content, as I was looking at some of your reports, was listed as 3rd most popular asset within the category, behind property entitlement and social posts. So are you seeing any best practices that are standing out with sponsored content that our listeners might benefit from?
Yeah, so the dominant sponsored content pieces are the ones that are the most obvious. So I'll state that first, meaning these brands want to be where the fan journey or the betting fans journey is. So statistics, player rosters, any sort of content around any insights that can be garnered from that. So you'll be hard pressed not to find a stats page, a roster that's not sponsored by a betting organization. Beyond that, though, the leverage of athlete player content, even in let's just take out pro sports for a second, is really interesting. So, for instance, if you get into the media space, Bleacher Report did a really creative thing around Charles Barkley with, I think it was like the Charles Barkley bogey prop that they had, and just really creative, engaging, things related to sort of unique bets that are taking place. You're seeing things like with Conor McGregor, prior to a fight with DraftKings, basically saying he's going to paint the floor with his next opponent, and you should make a bet on that, and literally driving sort of engagement from that perspective. So it's sort of leveraging the creativity to pull them in where it's authentic to the event that's taking place, but it's also relevant to saying, hey, this is also something that you can apply to what you're doing. And we've even seen things with Lolo Jones with Iowa when that came in. She's from Iowa, so they found sort of the most well-recognized person, but it also gave them opportunity in the video content that she put out, not only to talk about the state opening up, but also about Olympic betting that's going to be coming down the pike as well. All sort of interesting things that we've started to see within that.
Yeah, that's a great point with the Olympics right around the corner. So if you're looking into your crystal ball and you wanted to make some projections on what we might see in and around the Olympics, what are you seeing, or what do you think we'll see?
Well, you have athletes that are, especially in the Olympic space, that, separate from, let's say, the NBA or NFL, your larger, well-known athletes. These are athletes that for a certain period of time have all eyeballs on them globally. And so I think there's an opportunity at probably a lower price point to tie in authentically across a really diverse set of sports to start to be able to promote and sort of share what's going on within that space, or ex-athletes that are in that particular space as well, to be able to sort of say, hey, here's opportunities here. Here's my thoughts on this race or what's going on there. So I think probably a larger opportunity within the Olympics to be able to tell really authentic storylines across so many different events and sort of betting opportunities that take place that you just wouldn't be able to get at a price point that is probably incredibly reasonable to tie into that.
Right. Chad, as you're bringing more and more properties on board, if you're looking into states like Iowa, that's a good example. Where do you see the opportunities for the brands in sports gambling?
In the sense of being the first ones into where states are newly legalizing these?
Yeah. And I think of Iowa, and I certainly don't think of professional sports, but I'm thinking of minor league baseball. I'm thinking of college athletics that eventually will open up. But who will the winners be in a state like Iowa when it comes to bringing new sponsor dollars in with sports gambling?
Yeah, I think if it's looking at one of those major pro categories, obviously it's going to be whoever's the first one in with that largest fan base. But I think a big area of growth that could eventually be taking place is esports, because esports across the board, you're starting to see one team or another in every single state that is a dominant following across the board. And now we work with 50 plus esports organizations that are almost always looking for a betting partner where it's legal in their state. And a lot of times it's major assets, such as the jersey patches, presenting sponsor for the teams themselves, or oftentimes doing a lot of promotional campaigns through their Twitch streams or whatever they utilize for their streaming. So esports, while that's been an up and coming thing in this industry as well during COVID, one of the few areas that was able to thrive on the digital side, I think a lot that are going to be able to tap into esports where it makes the most sense. That's going to be a big area of growth too.
Great point on the jersey patches, because I was putting some work together for my students in the spring, and I think 9 of the EPL teams over in Europe had sports gaming sponsors on their jerseys. So it's probably a sign of things to come as some of the leagues begin to loosen things up. I noticed in the one study, though, you had 130 unique brands that were related to the category. And so there's got to be some new money coming in, maybe from Europe, Australia, and other places that some of our listeners wouldn't be that familiar with. So do you see someone kind of creeping in as time goes on?
Bet Rivers has been pretty aggressive. For those that might not be as familiar with them, they've started to expand in a lot of different markets across the country that you might not be aware of as well, and some significant partnerships across pro sports. So they're a newer sort of expanding brand in the space that I think will continue. A Bet 365 has sort of looked at New York and tried to win there. If you look at them internationally, they're quite active. But they've really tried to own one particular market. I think the challenge is in the US is getting early enough to a market to make it worth your while, because if you're late, there's really, you're going to be putting a lot of money to try to get any sort of share of audience. And I think that's where, going into some places like esports, even in the media space, and to go back to your question before within Iowa, I think you're going to see probably the early entrance, like in an Iowa, is going to be across, the Bally Sports Network, for instance, just being able to sort of, market across that state in a place where they can basically reach the largest audience possible versus trying to set up these different smaller sponsorships as well. But those are sort of the two that we're kind of seeing that are kind of interest. There's a lot out there. It's kind of like fintech in some ways, and some other categories that we're tracking that are dipping their toe in the water, but none that have sort of rapidly expanded yet.
When do you think we'll see the floodgates open up at the collegiate level? So I was impressed to see Colorado come out when they did, and didn't see a whole lot of pushback within the media on it. And as COVID has really impacted college athletics budgets, I would seem to think that's the new property that we're going to see the most growth in.
You're already seeing, it's funny, college athletics, obviously in some cases typically follows, pro sports 5 or 10 years behind, and you're starting to see that in the beer, alcohol space and some other areas as well. So I do see it lagging behind a little bit, but I don't see it being that far behind in terms of a lot of partnerships being created. Once they've got a lot of other things going on with NIL, but
right.
I definitely see that as sort of the next logical conclusion, because you can make the argument, well, if you're able to market, beer and alcohol to this fan base, why would this be any different?
Yeah, and I know you've done a lot of work on cannabis. So are there some parallels that you're seeing as both cannabis and legalized sports wagering become more part of the mainstream in our country?
I don't know. I'm not exactly sure. I don't want to make a bet on that, because there's just a lot of factors that go into it legally that that's certainly something I'm not equipped to delve into too deeply. But in the cannabis space, we've certainly seen sort of, it's like anything else. You typically see challenger sports and entertainment that will start to launch some of these partnerships. And I think you start to see it against athletes and individuals next. So we've kind of seen that in the cannabis space. I think it does creep in like it will in the fantasy space as well.
Right. So the NFL's recent decisions to bring partners on board at the league level follows the teams that were allowed to do it. And I think you saw that in states where it was legal. So what do you think will come from that, Bob?
From the NFL?
You see leagues loosening some of their standards and some of the assets and what people in the category might get. I was looking through your information, and it was interesting to see, like, the NBA allowed what I would call TARP signage in the sports gambling category, where maybe the NHL didn't, and the NFL wasn't allowing a whole lot. So now that league has come on, do you think that the memos going out to the teams will give them a little bit more freedom on the assets that they might be able to provide?
We're in the perfect storm of sort of where the economy has been and what's happened, where there's never been a better opportunity to get creative and start to expand what those assets are. And we've seen this historically in the past, where a category starts, and I saw this in my time from 2010 to 15 in the NFL with the with the spirits category, in terms of being able or not being able to use of marks, and sort of where can those assets sort of be activated against, and gradually they expand out. Now, that was without any sort of major economic challenges taking place. Now we're in an environment where there's clear motivation to figure out ways in which additional revenue can be generated, given the given the environment that we're in right now. And it just does take one or two organizations, leagues, to start to loosen up, where now it's a competitive environment. Now you may be losing share of business to another league or another team if you're not really pushing that. And I think what you're going to see is, like, certain states, if you're in Denver or wherever, where now an individual team is fighting for business and they might be limited because they're in one league versus another, you can imagine pretty quickly that's going to get pushed up to the league level to say, look, this is clearly impacting our business if we're not able to do these things, and this standard has already been set in these other places. So I don't see that. I don't see this being sort of a fixed environment in terms of what assets are going to be leveraged against this.
Right. If let's go to assets. You guys have done a lot of work in looking at what's important and what matters in this space. What kind of stands out to you there?
Yeah, Chad, I don't know if you have any, but I mean, the biggest, most obvious one is co-branded content. I mean, digital dominates within this space in general. Signage has always been a critical piece of this, just again, to kind of plant the flag in the ground and make sure there's exposure in a competitive environment. But we are seeing some really creative integrated content pieces. I think it was Unibet and the Philadelphia Eagles essentially had a virtual game that was branded, the sort of like poker game that was branded against that as well. So you are seeing stuff that I think you would never even envision 5 or 10 years ago. That's creative, but also is actually engaging to the fan base.
I think something that I've saw that's really unique is the athlete endorsements, and these individual books, depending on the markets they're trying to promote, picking the perfect ones. Like, I'm based in Pittsburgh, and Bet Rivers, they pride themselves on being the primary book of Pennsylvania. Well, they chose Jerome Bettis to really promote them, to really draw in those Pittsburgh Steelers fans, because I immediately go back and think to the days of when the Steelers were winning Super Bowls and who was at the forefront of that. The Chicago Bears and PointsBet, Devin Hester, perfect one for anyone that's super loyal to the Chicago Bears brand and their fan base. So the uniqueness, for sure, as Bob mentioned, as we continue to grow in this industry and see how brands are just growing and what they're trying to do to pull in the fans, and way more than the standard signage and everything that we've always known. But yeah, picking the right endorsers and even things like unique codes based on fans of that individual promoter, seeing that and how the books are really getting unique that way.
Chad, go ahead, Bob. Go ahead.
What you're seeing is, I mean, again, because once the sort of physical venue was taken away, and a lot of fantasy lounges were sort of not as valuable because there's no fans in the stadium, teams were in general forced, obviously, to create much more content than they've ever sort of pushed out before. And so with that, they have to be more creative. It's not just more videos on the same stuff. It's really a lot of player content. It's a lot more insights, depth to what's been put out there, which I think is generally great for for all the sports leagues to be able to have that. Daily fantasy in general, and sort of the betting space, has number one, helped to underwrite some of these efforts or justify the investment in some of this content that's put out, and finding sort of the unique ways in which they could sort of bring this information to market. So I just think you've seen an explosion of sponsored video in general that was never there in the past. Shows that are created because of this. The number of ways in which this industry has tied into video in general is extremely diverse, and it's no more logo slaps anymore. While that still exists, it is really getting creative with sort of how our teams sharing sort of the numbers, the back end, the journey, which again is really authentic to the industry and what you want to know as well.
Bob, that's a great point. And I would think that you guys are busy on keeping an eye on new technology and new inventory and what COVID has produced, because the technology to deliver content is getting easier and the demand for content continues to go up. So share with our audience a little bit how you monitor that. Talk to them about your scouting system, because if something new is going on out there, you're going to find it.
Yeah, well, we had to, first of all, kind of standardize any asset that could be in a partnership. And, in the sponsorship space, as anybody in the audience would know, can be extremely diverse and continues to change, as we just spoke about. And so we had to come up with a standardized way of looking at any environment, whether it's a Lambeau Field or a Tribeca Film Festival or an individual, to consistently track assets to compare and contrast against a lot of different environments. And then within that, it's a blend of technology, which is a huge part of what we do. Every single social media post across Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter that has any brand, local, regional, national, we had to build the technology to sort of pull this information in and have a whole process of approval and the like, and sort of storing all that data. And so that allows us in real time, down to the minute, if any sort of assets are activated against the media space, we're able to store that information within our system and have that for it basically gets deployed to all different sets of reports by category, region, brand, property, you name it. The offline information, which might be not as much these days, but a community event, something that happens on site that can't be scraped digitally, is something that we deploy a massive team of people throughout the world now that essentially are capturing this information, storing it through video and images, and then we apply visual recognition technologies as well to sort of scale logo recognition within that and sort of mapping that to the correct assets that are in place. So in that regard, it's a little bit like Google Maps. We have to kind of physically drive. It's like driving a car down the street to get the actual street view of that information. It's just, for us, it's a continual process to get a lot of that offline information within that as well.
Well, you guys have done an amazing job building out your scouting system, and I'm happy to see that some of those scouts are coming out of Ohio University. So keep up the good work. Intersection of name, image, and likeness in sports gambling sponsorships. We're going to see some athletes whose eligibility is no longer in place. They've played as many years as they can, and it might be before the draft, or it might be that a knee injury keeps them out of playing professional. So right now, and Chad mentioned it, you'll see a Jerome Bettis coming through to be having endorsements in the space. But this is going to be a new opportunity for kids either in that in-between land before they sign a professional contract, or someone that was maybe a Heisman Trophy candidate that had a career-ending injury. So what are you seeing when you're looking at the intersection of name, image, and likeness and this category, and then name, image, and likeness in all categories?
Well, we've already seen, if you just sort of take the concept of name, image, likeness has been valued in most industries from a sponsorship perspective. So it's sort of been proven that this is an excellent, and even more so today, that this is an excellent mechanism to get out stories, in many cases to larger audience than even what the teams have in terms of their social following. As you get into the college space, and there's people a lot smarter than me that have thought about this problem a lot longer than I have, in probably some companies that we can all sort of think about. What we think about there is the window of opportunity on that side to be able to partner and deliver a message. Now, certainly technologies help to do that in a more real-time fashion in terms of, hey, here's an opportunity where there's this window of time where it makes sense to tie into this person. But that's something that has to be contemplated in terms of how much of a bet are you going to make in going into that particular space. Is this a long-term investment with a lot of different types of people, or is this a one-off opportunity that just makes sense in that moment to tie into that individual? Coupled with the fact that there may be some where, hey, this is an early bet with that person that they're going to be somebody that's going to be relevant beyond just the next 3 months of time as well. So it certainly provides the ability to come in and come out at a pretty low risk versus the traditional sponsorship space. So that's, a huge benefit, especially when you get into the betting space where, we rattled off, there's over 100 plus brands in this space. A lot of those brands don't have any recognition. So they're challenger brands that need to, they need to plant some flag in the ground and get some sort of semblance of recognition, where I think that athletes or sort of student athletes that their time has expired, it could be an opportunity for them to do it at a fairly low cost, because they've got to compete with, to compete with DraftKings and FanDuel and the amount of money that they're investing in marketing and whatnot. You're never going to be able to win. So you better find some unique and compelling stories that you can tell that gets the biggest bang for your buck at the end of the day.
Yeah, and you've been tracking FanDuel and DraftKings for a long time now. So coming out of that fantasy space, it really gave them a head start when you think about it.
It did. I can remember back in even the time that I was in the NBA with FanDuel and Brooklyn Sports and Entertainment. They were going through a process where when they initially came out, they were spending a lot of money in a lot of different places, and then they began to surround themselves with really smart marketers of like, here's the most efficient way to think about it. It was a little bit of the Wild West. They went through that process 8-10 years ago of sort of, okay, let's refine how we spend, where we spend, what are the metrics that we're looking to deliver against this. And so there's just there's a head start in that particular area. Sometimes money can be not necessarily the best thing, because you just sort of, there's a lot of waste that goes into it. On the flip side, when you do look at some of these challenger brands, and probably Monkey Knife Fight is the best example of this, where, relatively limited budget versus some of the larger organizations that are out there, they had to find environments and either teams where there was an opportunity and there's a real desire to partner with somebody in the space, and also with the flexibility to get really creative with what they do. And, a lot of the stuff that they had driven in their partnerships this year prior to being acquired had never been done before. They had a sponsored, I can't remember, the Curious Georges. It was the cutouts of their logo in a certain section within the Brewers ballpark. And it got picked up virally through, media. I mean, it was like a really creative thing. That wasn't part of the original partnership. That was something that was sort of, the idea came up through the partnership of, hey, could we do this? Could we try this? Again, they're just trying to gain the attention and gain a share of mind. And so I think you're still going to have that creative sort of challenger brand environment in this space. Does it really impact FanDuel and DraftKings at the end of the day? Probably not that much. And in fact, in many ways, they'll probably use those as good ideas for them to apply to their 100+ partnerships.
Right. Now, when you look at the cross-section between sports media and legalized sports wagering and sponsorship, there's going to be a lot of opportunities there. And first thing that pops into my head is Bally's recent acquisition of many of the regional sports networks across the country. And I'm guessing you'll be able to keep a close eye on it.
It's brilliant in terms of just getting your name being ubiquitous with the betting space, and probably a very cost-effective way versus the number of either individual partnerships that they would have to do. And, finding the right media company that was willing to do that, that's probably a very rare opportunity to find that. And, kudos to them for capitalizing on the opportunity to do that. And essentially it's like they're trying to become almost like Kleenex in that regard.
Yeah. Chad, when you're out marketing Sponsor United, are you picking up a lot of broadcast entities across the country?
Broadcast entities specifically isn't exactly where I play around. We have a team designated to the media side to bring on those partnerships, but we've had some pretty large players on board with us, and we grow right along with our partners, kind of hearing out what they would want to see on our platform in terms of our data collection and anything they're looking in terms of where the puck's going, not where the puck's now, and what's going to be trending.
Right.
So we try and stay really close. But yeah, media is not primarily where I work around with, but I know obviously our product is built for not only the property side, it's built for agencies, media, brand across the board now, like a Swiss Army knife. And media is definitely an area of growth for us in the future.
Let's spend a minute and talk about the agencies, because I don't want to assume that everybody listening to this broadcast is on the sales side of sponsorship, but talk to me and our audience a little bit about some of the intricate values that you can bring to a sports marketing agency.
That the agency can bring to the industry or to a particular brand?
Yeah, just by them being plugged into you, I mean, it's going to open their eyes to opportunities and insights that they didn't have before, and they're going to get it in real time.
On the agency front, we work with some amazing agencies that utilize our platform. You know, the data supplements, you know, the institutional knowledge that many of these agencies have gained over the years, as well as the direct relationships they have and just sort of understanding of pricing and opportunity because of all the different negotiation that they do. So it sort of further arms them with a broader context of what's going on in the space in a more real-time manner. Probably a good example of this, and something that we often will report on, is real-time metrics against what brands, categories are trending based on the 6,000 plus users of our platform. So we can sort of look literally down to the minute of like, what are the categories that are starting to emerge? And really a lot of that's driven by just deals and conversations that are happening, research that's happening in real time against some of these categories. So it's sort of, how do we inform earlier on in that process versus 6 months from now when a partnership takes place, it's publicized in the news. Oftentimes it's too late to do anything about it because it's been in the works for the last last year or so. So we try to inform on a lot of those sort of insights as well. But, you know, agencies are oftentimes tasked with much broader needs than just the NFL space or, you know, one particular region or market. And so they might need to pivot into non-traditional areas like esports or the endurance or combat space or out of home or sports media, and the amount of legwork that goes into that to pivot and sort of all of a sudden try to become a category expert in that space to inform your customers is can be a bit costly and inefficient in terms of the amount of time it takes to do that. So, you know, our platform allows you to sort of pivot immediately into sort of any space you want to. If you want to see what influencers do, like Kim Kardashian and the like, or if you want to see what's being done in minor league hockey in Canada, you essentially can do that right at your fingertips as well.
Yeah, and then as you continue to grow, I'm really impressed with the content you put out. So if the Super Bowl happens on a Sunday, boom, I'm getting a pretty quick read at all the different brands that aligned or invested in and around the Super Bowl. And that doesn't come without a staff and people working well into the early hours of the morning. So can you talk a little bit of, you know, how big your staff has grown as you continue to grow and the amount of content that you're putting out now?
Well, I give kudos to Chad to kind of kick things off, because he was one of the first people that was involved in this organization as we were starting to build this out. And he would, you know, if this was baseball, he'd be able to play sort of all the spots. And now he's sort of in the cleanup position, literally, I guess. And so we've sort of built that over the last 4 years with product and sort of market experts at scale. So I think, you know, going back to my prior point is, you know, our thought is, how do we scale deep knowledge on any market, any sport, any event, any brand, and then be able to serve that information. And so we've sort of built both a staffing infrastructure of deep market specialists in about 85 different cities across the U.S., Canada, and throughout Europe that really own market specific, if you want sort of regionalized information, as well as people that own about 35 specific verticals at a deep level. So if it's the NCAA or whether it's endorsements or whatever it might be, we have people that sort of own that and own teams behind that are sort of focused specifically on that space, coupled with the technologies to help them do that and gather this information in a much more rapid way, so that when you have, the NFL draft, let's say, that's coming up, we could see essentially immediately any player drafted and what they're tied into brand wise on that night, 3 days before, 5 days after, what that content looks like, as well as what every single team does, because we have people that are dedicated to the NFL specific, but then we have people that are dedicated to every single NFL team at a really deep level. And part of the preface behind that when we started that was to recruit people was not so much working for us at the time, 4 or 5 years ago, because we didn't have the staffing opportunities yet, but was how do you go into the job market and know probably more than 95% of the people at that actual team that you're looking to get a job with, because you've literally studied every detail of every piece of that team. Plus you have knowledge across the entire league from our platform and whatnot. So we kind of started with that mentality in mind. And now we've been able to really build up product experts across, again, specific categories, leagues, and markets as well. And that, we'll continue to do that. We're rapidly expanding in that space.
Bob, you and I spoke some time ago, but the motivation for this company was really what you saw other pieces of media having access to. And I remember having a conversation with you about broadcast radio and your ability to see who was investing where, and you looked at sports and there really wasn't anything there.
Yeah, my first half of my career was on the media side. And so having gone from media into sports, and I always tell people that want to get their foot in the door at a team, sometimes the best avenue isn't the direct avenue to get into that, because having come from that world and seeing, through consolidation and technology, and it's a pretty binary industry, broadcast media in terms of commercials, maybe it's diversified a little bit, but to realize that didn't exist in the sponsorship space, and it existed in media. And then really this was going back to the 2010s where social media and digital was becoming just so infused with real-time data and information for brand marketers to decide what to do with and what sellers can do. And so I sort of looked at the sponsorship space, which was innovating in like 30 different directions really well. And I think that's the value of sponsorship, is you can be so incredibly creative, some, different organizations, but there was no way to sort of have that all go in the same direction when things made sense. And having gone to enough away game stadiums and tournaments and the like, and seeing some really creative things taking place, and saying, boy, this would be amazing to do within our environment. It'd be great to get it everywhere. That was sort of the premise behind, like, well, what if you in theory could get everything in one place? And then, what kind of ideas and creative could you bring to the table if that were possible? So
I want to shift gears here for a minute or two, if I may, and talked about activation in this space. So I can remember when fantasy was just coming on board, but it was DraftKings or FanDuel. If I stopped by their booth outside Brown Stadium, they were going to give me $50 in a concession voucher. And that seemed like a no-brainer, but the cost of acquisition and getting customers into their systems, I got to believe, with the hope that people will be fan loyal to who they bet with, there's plenty of money to go around from an activation standpoint. So what are you both seeing when it comes to activation in this space?
Well, no, I'll say this, and then Chad, you can jump in. You hit the nail on the head. The cost of acquisition is upfront, but the loyalty to one platform, or sort of the stickiness to not really switch from one to the other, is where that cost of acquisition sort of drops the longer that customer stays around. And so I think that's where sort of being able to invest a tremendous amount in marketing dollars for that acquisition initially in the long term does pay off for these organizations. And you see it in the SaaS space in general too. Once somebody's on, it's inertia to sort of switch in those things. But I don't know, Chad, if you've seen specifically, some interesting activations in this space that you can share.
I'll say this. I mean, just ever since when I started here, and I was actually one of the scouts that was going out and snapping all those pictures and collecting all the imagery behind everything. I've seen it grow tremendously, again, just in terms of really making it all about the team and the brand loyalties, book by team partnership. Like when it first started with like a BetMGM, I would see more like the national talent endorser stage, like Jamie Foxx, right? But I've just been more and more impressed with how they're really incorporating, like I said earlier, unique brand promo codes. If it's the Pittsburgh Steelers, they have a game coming up using Pitt 25 to get a $25 boost on whatever bet you're doing. Like all of these books have their own really, really interesting ways to incorporate different fan bases. And they're oftentimes they're starting them off young too. As soon as you get to that legal betting age, there's a promotion and you get an X amount free bet. And if you're, using a fan codes with a certain team or a certain market. So yeah, I think they're starting to get to try people as soon as you turn that age limit, going right after those folks too.
That's the number one asset in activation for that space. It makes a lot of sense. Is promotions within all the different activations that are being done. And, we've seen some over the years. It's nothing new, but I think it was the Rangers and it might've been DraftKings. It was like up to $1,000 bonus if you sign up. So, there's some aggressive and creative programs to sort of get people excited to want to come on board within that. We're even seeing that in like the fintech space and others. If you look at, if anybody's ever had Robinhood, they give you a couple stocks for free when you sign up.
Right.
So that's, these are tried and true practices in a lot of different industries that I don't think was invented by the gaming space, but certainly is one that's worked for well before I ever started my career.
Right. And without naming names, because they're all good clients of yours. Chad, I want to throw this one to you. You probably see different levels of organizations willing to try new things, willing to push the envelope, where some organizations are going to not be early adopters. They're going to sit back and wait and watch. So the only name I'll throw out there right now, because I've done a lot of work in webinars with them, I'm really impressed with what Monumental Sports is doing. And they got out in front of it, and they have a sports book and bar partnership with William Hill inside their arena. So Chad, once again, no need to name names, but you could almost see early in your scouting days that some teams were more willing to get after it and get out of the box. Would that be a fair assessment?
Absolutely. I think you see a lot that are more about the strategic partnerships kind of aspect of it, not as many brand partners as teams that are just blitzing, trying to sell as many outfield wall billboards as possible and overwhelm someone that attends the stadium. I think there's something to be said for being on the forefront of those new types of assets as we continue to optimize, revolutionize in the industry. That I was also impressed. I remember I was actually at the conference last year in DC through George Washington University, and Zach Leontis was talking about that William Hill deal and it really being the first of its kind. And now you see how many more brands are starting to get involved just in that particular sportsbook category with major pro teams. Like Bob was talking about the numbers earlier. I think the one report you read from 2020 identified 120 or 130 so brands in our system. So now, in terms of current last 12 months alone, today, when I just took a look at it, it's in the 220s. So now the number of opportunity, and even internationally across like European soccer, things like that, they were really starting to see these new press releases come out of, wow, that's the most unique asset I've ever seen. That's starting to happen much more frequently.
And Monumental, is a good example with them in particular, and great partners. But when the NBA 2K came out, I think it was about 3 years ago, we were tracking all the 2K stuff. Of all the teams that had a 2K team, they had so many creative, unique partnerships. And, part of that is just investing in the space and saying, look, we're going to monetize this, we're going to be creative. But these weren't just simple, like, hey, we're going to have digital signage and the like. They were creating co-branded content around, I think it was like Bud Light with happy hours with their gaming athletes, which they could technically do. They couldn't do that with their sports athletes.
Right.
Creating a tremendous amount of content around that with the supermarket partner that they have down there and doing things on site, how to eat and stuff. So they really, that I think some organizations, it's certainly in their DNA to be creative, either because they're a challenger team and they need to sort of fight and claw for that share of business. So we see that a lot as well, versus sort of relying on, sort of the size of their audience and whatnot. And they did a really good job of that. So it doesn't surprise me that when this new environment comes along, that they don't think creatively about how to activate against these different environments. I will say that this year, I think, has taught everybody that you can't take the physical stadium for granted anymore. And, while, early on, there might have been some hesitation in terms of what to do, and we'll just sit back and wait. I think once teams realize that this is going to be here for a while, and these challenges are going to be here for a while, eventually, I would say most of them have stepped up their game considerably to be creative in terms of what those partnerships look like. So I really think that, this last year has been an accelerant of what probably should have happened in the industry in terms of innovation, investment in their content teams, investment in activation that you've seen with other organizations, that now more of them are really adopting those same best practices.
Yeah, I think the cross section of COVID and digital advertising just met at the perfect time, because teams they had time. They had some time to slow down a little bit and think about, my gosh, what am I going to do? People aren't coming to my arenas and my stadiums, so I've got to get creative from a digital standpoint.
Yeah, that and their own athletes are their own publishers at the end of the day. So even if this wasn't happening, in many ways, that's share of audience, and it could be even much larger audiences than the team has in some cases, and more flexibility in terms of how they can be creative and what they can put together. So there's certainly more openness than ever before to create these sort of partnerships.
Okay, we're getting closer to the end here, but maybe some quick words of advice from both of you. If you were talking to a professional sports franchise in the state where legalized sports wagering has not been adopted yet, what advice might you tell the people in partnerships with regards to this category?
Chad, you're on the front lines in sales, talking to many teams. If you want to take a stab to begin.
Well, it's not actually like this category specific, but in terms of everyone I talk to, it seems that now the new thing is looking for capabilities of streaming. And kind of like you mentioned earlier, that for a while people weren't able to attend live venues, that streaming is the next up and coming thing. Again, we've always been listening to our customers, what's trending. I really believe that that's next. And specifically, this category has gotten behind buying those types of assets across streaming, across digital. So I guess pertaining to this discussion, my suggestion would be to really focus on those ways to reach people that aren't going to be able to get out of their seats and go to the venue, but watch from home, and institute those promotions live in the game in the streaming side as well, not just those watching on national TV live at the venue, but streaming from their own computers or whatever it may be at home.
Right.
Never before has the onus been on properties to, number one, educate themselves in these categories. I mean, every month there's a new emerging sort of subcategory that's starting to get traction in our space, where, this was a very fixed environment for many years with beer, telecom, auto, and the like. Now you're seeing this is the broader advertising community in general, but the need to really educate yourself on the nuance of the legalities in some cases, not only externally, but if you look at, let's take financial as a good example with crypto, fintech, banking, where can those partnerships extend? Where do they sort of converge into what, your other partnerships look like? So really being a student of that, of whatever particular industry and open categories that you're going after is, I think, really important. as well as the creative solutions to get unique stories out. I mean, we're just in a creative, we're in a competitive environment. There's a lot of buying options for brands to choose from right now, and a lot of organizations that are willing to get creative with that, and a lot of sort of digital extensions to do that. And so I think the onus then goes back on the teams as well to realize, look, we have this incredibly passionate fan base that's unique to, let's say, the media world, which is much more of a transactional sort of relationship and getting more and more fragmented. But now it's how do we leverage that to tell compelling stories that are authentic to the DNA of our organization and what we're attempting to do, and then distributing that out to all the different points, which, they need that in regards to being able to fight for, hey, this is why it's valuable, because it doesn't just rely on the sort of physical venue anymore.
Right. And great point on education, because when we first started this sports gambling education program, it was really designed for college athletic directors. But what we're seeing with COVID is that if you're the sponsorship guru with a professional sports team and you've been asked to really dig in deep on sports gambling, those are the folks that are signing up for our courses right now. And I think the need to educate in the space, because 50 states, not one size is going to fit all. And every state's going to have its own nuances when it comes to sports gambling.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, gentlemen, we are all but out of time. I cannot thank you enough. We'll have to come back and maybe do this again in 4 to 6 months, because I think this category is going to continue to explode, and would love to stay in touch with you as it does.
Jim, we're always here for you. Whatever you need, you just let us know. Big fan of what you do, and many a partnership we've gained from former students of yours or people that work with us now. So can't.
Well, any of those Bobcats that haven't signed up for Sponsor United, let's get on the phone in the chat and let's get that going.
I love it.